Welcome to day 2 of 23. We have a lot of material to go through. We're going to start off with Phil Esocoff's talk, and then we're going to actually do the start of the. We're going to actually do the start of the introduction and everything else. We're going to move it back to after Phil Esocoff's conversation about the recreational dialogue. Phil Esocoff is a celebrated Washington, D.C. architect, and for purposes of our community, likely the most outstanding of them. He does real buildings that you can see from the street. He has done many of them, and they all look like buildings. In other words, neuroaesthetically, the brain actually does recognize them in the first 50 milliseconds of seeing them, does recognize them as buildings. He's going to talk about today's challenging reality that make us uncomfortable. And he is one of the inspirations, or the inspiration, for theming this traditional architecture gathering on the future, what it can look like, buildings that are built well enough to look good in 50 years. So I want to welcome Phil Esocoff. Welcome to TAG 23. Thank you for helping coordinate it, organize it, and make it happen. You have the floor.
Okay. All right. So I'll summarize what I'm showing here, which is that in Washington, D.C., we have certain parameters for planning the city that go back to the L'Enfant Plan, the 1910 Hyde Act, and the projections into public space. And so what you'll see are buildings that join with their surroundings to create the definition of public space through the free expression that is guaranteed by the First Amendment. So in a way, the city provides an opportunity to metaphorically show the idea that everybody's getting together to define the public realm. So while L'Enfant came up with a two-dimensional plan, it's up to the individuals in the city, citizens of the city, to define what that is in three-dimensional reality. And so we have a plan that is calibrated to our climate. There's very wide streets with were intended to be covered by elm trees, the way that tracery of a cathedral is defines the vaulting. And then we have, gracious public realm. And we also have the ability to project beyond our property lines. So while the property lines are at the face of the building, you're allowed to project forward to the property line 4 feet. And you do that with a cantilever because you can't put a column down to support that edge. And that has sort of created a certain facility with structural systems like post-tension concrete slabs. And it's also enriched the modeling in sunlight of the facades of these public rooms that we create. And that ability to project forward was the outcome of an immigrant from Germany, Adolf Kloos, in 1858. And he said, well, nobody's taking care of their front yards from the back of the sidewalk to the face of the building. It was supposed to be the city. And he said, well, let's let everybody project forward to the property line. And as a quid pro quo, they can sort of take that on and make it into a garden or an entry court, put up a fence along there. And so all of these planning and urban design, say, parameters have led to a certain kind of architecture where you do have a primary facade, like you might in Paris, and then secondary and tertiary facades. And so you'll see buildings that we've come up with that are an outcome of that. But, I grew up in a working class neighborhood, immigrant families, my grandparents all came over, and there's my grandmother on the left. And she had a canvas shop that she took over when she was widowed early on with 3 daughters. 2 of them are in this photograph on the right. That's my aunt, Ruth, in the front, my mother in the back, keeping her hair drying. But I wanted to point this out is that my grandmother could make a canvas liner for a swimming pool for our concrete backyard. And I could play around in her shop and learn how to put grommets in the side of canvas and then lash it to this wooden frame that my uncle, who lived next door, my great uncle, who was an electrician, he taught me, well, how do you put together that wooden frame and how do you lash this together? And so I was an early adopter of architecture. And you can see here a submission I sent into Robert Moses. It was rejected, 14 at the time. So that experience and playing in the sandbox late enough into the evening that the police had to come find me so that I could actually do a master plan for the entire city in that sandbox. From there, I went on to the University of Pennsylvania. There's old Ben Franklin, and the building behind it is the Fine Arts Library, designed by Frank Furness. And it's across the main architecture school, which is great because you could look out at a really beautiful building. And Lou Kahn's studio was in the upper reaches of that building. And when Franklin found the university, he talked about teaching everything useful and everything ornamental. But by ornamental, he meant the liberal arts. They were supposed to really know everything about culture and history, and that you needed to bring that to bear on your life as a responsible member of the body politic. I have to say, in between going to undergraduate at Penn, I spent a year at the Architectural Association, and that year was instrumental. I studied under Keith Critchlow, who later went on to teach at the Prince of Wales School and Institute, very much into geometry. But also I had two very pivotal weeks I spent under the tutelage of John James, Australian architect, who spent decades studying the process of construction Chartres Cathedral. And on the North Porch 50 years ago, I spent two very cold, chilly weeks looking at just two courses of stone on the plinths that hold up the columns that hold up the porch. And when I started that study, I perceived that there were 28 stones. And when I was done, I realized that there were actually 3 motifs that defined a certain building campaign that layered over each other as strata. And I could even look at 6 quatrefoils and determine that the one on the left was done by the master mason and the other 5 were the apprentice. And it takes 2 weeks to study and train your eyes to look at that level of pixels to understand what's going on. And those 2 weeks have really informed a lot of my career, that obviously lots of other. So here's a project I'd like to show before going to Washington, D.C., because it is somewhat informed by Washington, D.C. This is a picture of Virginia Tech down in Blacksburg, Virginia. It's been around since the 1840s or 50s in different iterations. And then when state universities were created, it became a state university. So it became Virginia Technic Institute and State University. And that oval field, which is a drill field, was laid out, and a lot of those buildings were designed starting in 1905. It's laid out by Ralph Adam Cram, and some of those buildings bear a striking relationship to another project they did, which is West Point. But after World War II, that drill field was a clearing in the woods. After World War II, people came back and they did a master plan in 1945, where they actually drove that 2-lane highway from the center of town through some greenery and a sloping hillside into the campus, and it was left kind of open. So you can see my cursor, that this bridge building, which we designed, and its extension, complete the definition of that oval. So it took about 95 years, this building was completed in 2000, to start over on the upper left-hand corner at the end of the drill field, surrounded with these collegiate Gothic buildings and quadrangles, and then finally create a portal that was appropriate. And there are several pylons here, 8 pylons that are part of, a forest perspective. Were designed by Harbison, Huff, Livingston, Larson. John Harbison taught in Beaux-Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, and that firm is a successor firm to Paul Cray, who taught at Penn when Lou Kahn was a student. So I'll show you on the left too, here's a building by Cambridge 7. It just had some blank brick walls here. It's a student performing arts center, completely out of character with what you would expect to be along the sides of this mall. And we I participated in a master planning effort with Sasaki, where I did the design guidelines for the campus. And one of the first things I came up with when we interviewed for a building down there was to create these sketches of what I thought could be iconic moments that would be worthy of being postcard image of the campus. So you see a view through an archway to these pylons. That was the first shot, and then a view from this reading room up there, overlooking the pylons. And I want to say something. There's University of Virginia, which Jefferson founded, and that's sort of the Harvard of Virginia. But there's an MIT in Virginia also, and that's Virginia Tech. I'm sure some people will dispute all of this, but it's my take on it. Coming from a working class community, I love the idea that we founded state universities, sort of a public infrastructure, to allow people to rise through their own merit and hard work, and to therefore be better human beings, and but also become contributors to society in the fullest way possible. And so the idea here was that here's this broad entrance way. And one of the things I learned from Washington, D.C. is that the column, Washington Monument, is about 1/10 the distance, and its height is about 1/10 the difference to the Capitol and to the Lincoln Memorial. And those pylons were about 50 times shorter than they needed to be, or 5 times shorter than they needed to be. But by putting the bridge where I did, you could create an appropriate view through there. And I think later on people are talking about neurobiology, but also how we function, how we perceive the environment. And we perceive things as postcard images. And here's the reality of the building: 11 windows across. And this is a reading room. So you drive under this building, and in the lower left, you can see there's a little gap there. Because I want to make sure, as a modern architect, that nobody mistook this for an arch. This is a proscenium. So you're looking through here to the world, the outer world, and the other direction, you're looking into the world of academia. So it's a moment of transition. And this bridge connects the hard copy of the existing library to an area where they do research into using digital technology for research, teaching, and learning. And so it's festooned with ornament. And some of the ornament is quite literal. Up here, the areas of research, agriculture, science, chemistry, engineering, and military service. It's one of the reasons for the state universities treat teacher officers. And these little finials, they encapsulate steel columns that are brought outboard, so there are no columns poking in to the space of the building because they wanted to be incredibly flexible. And then we came up with this ornamental motif, which is like radio antennas, like you see here. And then we etched that surface. And that goes back to that experience of Shard, where you have to scratch these surfaces to get the light and shadow to work in different daylight conditions. Because we modeled this in the computer, put different sunlight conditions on it, and it washed out until we did that, until we scratched the surface except for the very edge. So you can see that light highlight. And then we have these, what look like leaves over here, sort of a floral thing, but they're actually books that are opened up. And I like language. And so when you think about browsing through a book, browsing is different than grazing. Browsing is eating leaves off a tree. And so when you leaf through a book, you browse that book. I thought, well, that's sort of a floral relationship. So these open books become what look like almost some kind of floral image, right? And then the state flowers. And so here's that reading room, and it's actually made tall enough that if they ever want to build in a second row of barrels, they could even stack them and put sort of metal stacked balconies if they like. And then over each of the windows, there's the different kind of ornamental motif. And this one is about the cutting edge research in animal husbandry of the day and in agriculture. So you see the DNA strand and you see an ear of corn. And this building was completed in 2000, but it's being designed in the late 90s. And so when the scientists said, we asked them what should be up there, they wanted to have something that was emblematic of cutting edge science. So what you're looking at are two identical sheep, Dolly and, well, Dolly. And so this cloning just started in 1997. So this kind of sets the date of the building for anybody who really wants to think through what they're looking at. And then, this kind of plywood arched ceiling is acoustically designed. I spent a whole weekend working through this. But you can also do abstract ornaments. So here's a building for George Washington University, just the detail of it. And you can see this stainless steel ceiling that's engine turned to sort of recreate the quality of hammered silver, which would be more the colonial spirit of Virginia. So now let's go to DC. And this building goes back to, it was designed in the late 80s. And so it was completed covered from 1991. And it's a mixed-use high-rise building on Pennsylvania Avenue, not where they have the inaugural parade, but closer to Georgetown. And you can see the Palmetto Antifixa, if that's the right term, at either end, one being the US flag, the other being the District of Columbia flag. And then we create sort of, a cornice line here using these projecting balconies. And then in the center of the building, there are two adjoining balconies with privacy with this glass block screen and this threaded column. And you can look down the street to the Washington Monument. And so here you can see the upper reaches of the building, very 19th century. I think Furness would like this building. And then you see the base, middle, and top of the overall building. And this is kind of an interesting building in that it has retail at the base, an entrance to office function on the corner. And so the second, third, and fourth floors are office. But if you enter in the middle of the main facade, you also have a symmetrical entrance, which suggests we own this building. But in fact, the people who come in here, they live on the 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th floors. And we didn't bother to overly differentiate the windows by type, because if people wanted to make this all office, they could, or they convert it to all residential, they can do that. So I think that was one of the things that John Simpson was talking about yesterday, this idea that buildings should be adaptable. And going back to that building at Virginia Tech, one of the lessons of college buildings is that they're always changing. The first architecture studio I had at Penn was in a building that had started out 100 years earlier as the geology building. It had become a dental school, became architecture, and now it's computer sciences. And the parameters that define that building, its floor heights, its structural capacity, and the character and heft of its exterior are why it is both treasured and therefore preserved, but it's not at the expense of its programmatic functionality. So here we see the base of the building. This Vetterstone actually is one of the sponsors, Vetterstone, which I use because I love it, but also because it's the stone that was used to build the Philadelphia Museum of Art, among many other fantastic buildings. And you'll notice that these anchorage points for these awnings that go over the retail, they are topical ornament, like Paul Cray would design at the Pan American Union building, where he would use Mayan glyphs as ornamental motifs rather than Greco-Roman motifs. And so we have donkeys on the right, elephants on the left, and here's the flag. There's something ringing in the background, and a close-up. And so these are molded, not carved. And then you see these anchorage points. And so one thing that both Amy and I have worked on is to make sure that when we're doing ornament, we're trying to use modern means and methods. And so these silhouettes were cut out on a flat piece of steel and then folded and then welded into this location. And by the way, elephants, if their trunks are up, that's hostile. So we made sure that they were in that sort of helpful position. And so where does some of this come from? Our neighborhood, this building down the block from us, designed by Joseph Abel, who was actually a partner of my wife, Amy Weinstein, FAIA, who designed some wonderful buildings, both modernist and also more traditionalist in the city. And he had a wicked sense of humor. So he has these gremlins on top, either dunking basketballs or throwing things down at you. And also you notice these arches that are open and the notch in the building. A lot of that's the inspiration for when you look at 2401 and the way this building curves back, one, to provide diagonal views for units in the middle of the building, but also to create sort of a proportional characteristic. Each end of the building is 60 feet wide by 90 feet high, which is a better proportion, more in keeping with the surroundings. And here are these ginkgo leaves. Once again, in the last ice age, ginkgo trees were wiped out in North America. So they were re-imported from Asia where they had survived. So one of the first buildings I did when I started my own office in 1995 was this apartment house And it takes full advantage of our bay projection allowances and also our allowances for piercing our height limit. So our height limit is an outcome of someone building a building, different immigrant from Britain, built 1,000 buildings in DC, Harry Wardman. And he built a building nobody expected, 160 feet high, and they didn't know if they could fight fires there, but it also cast shadows on the neighborhood. So people hustled around and came up with a temporary height limit. And then 1910, they codified it. And so people think of it as a limit. I hate when I use that word. There's really a schedule of heights. It's the right heights for buildings on certain width streets in the district. In the same way that on a window schedule, those are the windows that go in the opening of your facade. So our schedule of heights suggests the proper size buildings, the width of the street plus 20 feet, that are appropriate to define a gracious and engaging and lively public realm in the district. And since lots of buildings don't go the entire length of a block, you have to figure out how to add something interesting to that conversation, along with other people, without shouting over them, but also without sort of folding your arms and slumping back in your seat. And so these little chimneys you see at the top are really kitchen, dryer, and toilet exhaust, so that we don't have lots of penetrations in the facade of the building. And these bay projections allow diagonal views up and down or broad avenues. And these are little subtle things. For instance, if you look on the left there, see how that curve comes around. That means that I had to stop that bay projection and create a window seat here. So you could see the full curve of that bay at that one moment, hovering over the sidewalk. And then at the top, we pulled it down so you could see that curve read against the sky. And, you know, some of these are little lessons like going to Finland and seeing how Oliver Aalto, up through one of his theater buildings, to create a lively exterior without going nuts, reshaping a building into something that was at odds with its interiors. Here's another picture of that, limestone at the bottom, brick, and carefully detailing windows. So let's go over to another building called the Whitman. And this was a project near our convention center that it was across the street from some historic buildings I'll show you in a moment. And so we were allowed to go up 65 feet plus a little cornice and create these facades that once again were in the proportion of a townhouse, but 67 feet tall. And then we divided them up and created oblique views out the sides of these sort of plates. And yesterday I was saying how, you know, as a modern architect, I want to make sure people understand these are facades. These are like a Roman warrior holding a shield. It's not sitting on the ground. And then we've got the battered base. These are cast stone, I think Arban supporting our effort. They did this, and they also did these wonderful floral ornamental panels, because the real estate agents decided to name it the Whitman. Said, okay, well, Whitman, what should the ornament be? I thought of his poem collection, Leaves of Grass. So we came up with this little leaf pattern and created a screen there for the people on the top floor here. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 floors. The buildings across the street are only 4. But by ganging the windows into vertical groupings, we're able to create what looked like more like a grand Victorian townhouse than a 6-story building, which could have had identical windows all the way up. And on the ground level, we actually made 13-foot wide units. So this assemblage here that's a window wall in front of a 2-story space about 10 feet deep. And on the balcony behind it is your bedroom. And you can enter this from inside the building, but you technically, by zoning, you could have an entrance here. So if you had a violin shop or you did some other small business, you could actually hang an awning out here and enter the building all along here, because it's a mixed-use district. But that's not how the building functions. It's a condominium. And so here, the building where it's set back 40 feet, many of the units there get they're 2-story units that have these 40-foot deep gardens. And at the very top, we have these ateliers that are actually 19.5 feet wide. And some of these forms relate to the forms of the buildings across the street, which you can see on the right-hand side there. It's sort of really grand opera, as I was describing yesterday, with lots of greenery and big flights of stairs and brownstone details. And this over the top, you know, Brunhilde kind of from Ring of the Nibelungen, crazy makeup. And so this building was trying to do something rather similar, but having been in Basel, there seemed to be some rather large hairdos also in the buildings. This is a larger project. It's built around what was a seminary school in the right-hand corner here. That's turned into condos, and we redesigned the whole block. And there was a building in the middle, I guess it was sort of the caretakers of this assemblage of religious buildings. And we put in, across from these rather small townhouses, two buildings that were 110 feet high, with some setbacks at 90 feet. And then we held up these bay projections above the ground. And then we also ganged our windows into two-story expressions that widen as they go up. And of course, this slit in the building and that widening really relate to the Lucan's Exeter Library building. So it sort of suggests that building, and this one suggests that this wall is not necessarily the old-fashioned wall that some people would think it might be, but it has that sort of feel. I like to say that, you know, if there's a hurricane, I'd like to be known as the person who created buildings that you want to run into, not out of during a hurricane. And so in order to meet the street in a gracious way, we simply took these balconies that run up between, you know, this is a balcony. That's a unit, has like a little step-out balcony there, a Juliet balcony. Here, there's a balcony. And this unit below that is the same one-bedroom unit. But we said, well, why don't we just bring some stairs out? And those stairs will come out on the same 26-foot rhythm as the townhouses generally across the street. And this overhang is at about the same height as the cornice of these little 2.5-story townhouses across the street. And that's how we manage to bring large buildings like this into scale, a proper scale relationship to lower rise neighbors. So a lot of the buildings we have, we were able to win the approval of the community groups that come and testify at the Zoning Commission, at the Commission of Fine Arts, and at the DC Historic Preservation Review Board. So we became known for being able to get buildings approved because they were worthy of approval, and we knew how to talk about them and explain why they were worthy of approval, and how the close-up of this entrance to the courtyard or the muse behind here, that it was calibrated to recreate the spirit of the ironwork in the neighborhood. And that, you know, you can look at a building and be able to say, oh, I live in this bay. I'm the middle window 3 stories up. Quite a different thing than if it's 12 windows that are identical all the way across the building, and you can't tell one from the other. So there's that. I think that's characteristic of some of the buildings we saw presented yesterday. And then there's also, we're working for developers. So the other thing about doing a direct access to a unit like this, it means that units that might otherwise be diminished, their sales appeal are sort of, you find a subgroup, a sub-demographic that wants to be able to just come right into their unit with their bicycle or walk directly out of their unit and feel like they live in a townhouse. And so it flips the script. And of course, your window sill is well above people's eye level here. And the shrubbery and the fence give you a pretty good modicum of privacy in the base of the building. And so people have a small dog they want to leave outside, they can leave them outside in that courtyard. And of course, a lot of these projections then are allowed because we use that post-tension slab. And by cantilevering it out to 4 feet, you actually create an upward thrust for the middle span. And that sort of helps reduce the stresses, makes it more economical. And here you can see, once again, these cast stone elements. Our band did those for us. And this was done after the Virginia Tech project. So many people would say, look at these, and they'd say, well, how'd you get all those different colors of precast? And we didn't. It was all the same color. But because of the modeling we did on the surface, based on looking at terracotta modeling and actual limestone modeling, we learned how to make our molds reflect that. And so molds this is a precast concrete building that Amy Weinstein at FAIA, my colleague and partner in life, designed down at Capitol Hill. And it's corbelled brick. There are no curb bricks in this. we just generated, using the computer, we generated the corbelling. So there are far fewer molds than you might imagine here. And the concrete that this brick is laminated to, that concrete, precast concrete, once again had a rubber form liner that was the pattern of the mortar joints. And so the bricks were sort of snapped into that before the concrete was placed into those molds. And so these were then hoisted into place. And, once again, we doubled the heights of the windows. So when people in the community look at this, they see it as a 1, 2, 3, 4-story building. It's, in fact, it's 7. And it has the proportion overall of a Victorian window. So it looks like a 2/2 window, but it's this wonderful element. And, we use a computer to figure out how to do this with the least number of, make it as rich as possible with the fewest number of molds, and then transfer that computer file to our cast stone folks. And they send that to the mold makers. And so it's important to understand the process and how you go about doing that in order to pre-digest that before talking to your client about showing something that may look rather ambitious and expensive. And what you've done is you've actually value engineered it, not cut its cost, but found a way to get more for the same amount of money or a small percentage more. This is the building next to that, where this panel brick, these textures that were done in like a projection of about 1 inch, they were all done by figuring out how to do a brick that is a different shape and plan. So Amy came up with this and had that form made. So the masons just have to lay a brick on one course this way, and then the next course up, they lay it the other way. And you get these checkerboard patterns all over the building. And then the ground floor is cast stone. And there's a lot of individuality here, just as there are in Victorian building, lines of Victorian buildings in DC. But this is an apartment house. And you enter under the curved overhang on the right, and there are corridors inside the building. But if you live on the ground floor, you have a gate and a yard and your own little recessed entrance. So it really creates a different living experience that people enjoy. And of course, this building has a green roof and swimming pools. One thing about Washington, because of our height limit, is like you pour the highest and best use waffle batter into the waffle iron, you slap it down, you get this great buildings. But it means there's a whole secondary city, a whole plateau of green roofs with swimming pools, gardens, and all kinds of other recreational features. And then using that system of projection, we're able to create larger bays, as you see on the left, and on the right, you can see we have some that are a series of balconies that look down towards Union Station on this building. And then we have to have a setback on this one particular street, Massachusetts Avenue. Once you come to 110 feet, you have to set back 1-to-1 for the next 2 floors, and that's it. But you can extend these frames above that because they are what are called embellishments. So it doesn't have any real purpose. You can do that. And so you might say, well, why would a developer allow us to build something that didn't have a purpose? Well, the purpose was to get this building approved when they went down to the Office of Planning, because it needed some sort of zoning relief from what was being done. So there's sort of a good cop, bad cop here, which is that we know how to talk with these people. And we can tell our clients, look, they're going to hold your feet to the fire. And if you don't do something special at the top, why would they allow you to put two more floors on the building? And we'd like to point out those 2 floors are not at the bottom, they're at the top of the building with the best views. So that's how we got these approved. And then like this piano curve, we didn't want to do the same thing we've done on the left. So we did this piano curve living room. And we came up with a custom hinge mullion so that they didn't have to have a different extrusion for every single one of these angles. They get the same one, and it's almost like a barrel hinge. They could move the window and snap it into place. So you really have to dig into how things are made and go to the factory. But then when that building comes down to the ground, that was an early shot. We civilized the base of this very tall building. And this is what people see when they're looking down the street. This is your eye level view. There's a cafe, there's a guy, of course, looking at his phone. And then there's small understory trees, and then larger street trees along the edge. And if you turn around the corner, following this curve, once again, we created these entrances, and then it has these nice little overhangs. And so people like, one of these has like a pink flamingo sitting out on the porch. And then once again, there's that lower level unit, and this is just a 1-bedroom unit you enter. Going back to the middle slide, if you were to walk along this street, there are actually units where there are 2-level units. Let's go back right here. There'd be a unit that's a double height unit with a 2-story living room. And once again, it's entered from the entrance of the corridor, but you actually have your own garden, and it's not quite as deep as this. So we have 2-story units there in other areas of these buildings and elsewhere. So we really like to play around providing a lot of different unit types on the building. Just the building, there's a steel lintel up here. And here you can see where we sort of lace the brick together, create this nice light and shadow effect. There are those overhangs. So there's a little dining table in there. And so people can reserve that, and they can sit there and look at the monumental quarter piece. There's a building where we created these like almost like curtains, swag tops. We did that where we didn't have a window because it's very hard to create a window that has a head like that using aluminum. But you can see these sort of screen walls with balconies, and then these windows that are paired but also slid. So you might notice that some of these different lapels that come out are different on one side than the other. And then there's this rooftop garden. You're allowed to do towers, spires, domes, minarets, and other types of embellishments. And then we also created this kind of entry sequence. I saw these big round bollards in Barcelona one time. You might have guessed I've been in Barcelona a number of times. So here are these star and moon pattern. And this is the heavens. And so this is a pattern I found in a book from 1618 from Johannes Kepler. And it was 2-dimensional line work. And having started many, many years earlier, this is 2016, but going back to, say, well, into the 90s earlier, looking at how light plays off things, we learned how to put various little ridges and insets to make light make this look beautiful in reality, not necessarily in a rendering that we put on a website. And so that's how we came up with that. And of course, once again, this was our band Class Stone. We had a great collaboration with these guys, but they tell us, well, you have to change your mold because you can't pull the concrete out of anything like that unless it's got a slight draft to it. And then we can talk to the mold makers and figure out what it costs to do this. And so when you look at the top of this building, you'll see these different size panels, but they all started from this one, the mold for this one panel. And so we figured out how to cut it at different points and turn it in a way that the pattern continued beyond, say, this little joint. A little bit like when you see a cloud through a window with a mullion, the cloud doesn't start over again. It's as though the cloud, there's a part of the cloud you're not seeing. So this is where you can use the computer economically to find a way to use one mold to do, I think there were like 20 panels. One mold can be used to make 50 panels before it starts to deteriorate. But the resin positive that is used to make the rubber liner, you can make then, say, 50 rubber molds from that. So if you were to put this on a parking garage, you could reduce the cost to $1 a square foot. And I'm saying all this because architects need to learn to understand how you go about using an economy of means to achieve these things, or else you're never going to get them approved. You won't even know how to do it. So you have to sort of practice each time. You learn a little bit more about the process and how to get something as rich as some of the historic buildings we've seen. So here's the last project I'll show. My wife and I came to Washington, D.C. in 1979. She grew up here. So we moved here after living in Philadelphia for a number of years. I was there for like 13 years. And then we lived in the building on the right, which is from 1910. And we were not the top floor, but the second floor down underneath that hip roof. But when we approached this building, the first thing that came to my mind was this gazebo. And I'll show you a picture of that from across the bridge. I said, wow, we could get married on the roof of this building. And ever since then, I've always felt like I'd like to do buildings where people look at them and say, I want my life events to be in this building. I want to invite people here for Thanksgiving. I want to get married on the roof of that building. I want to bring my kids up in that building because that building is me. And I don't even know who the architect was. That building has its own life. And so when we got married, we looked across the street to that low brown building you see. And then another building that was an intrusion into this historic district was just a brick box with repetitive brick building, windows, strip windows, and in pink brick. And it was orthogonal, had nothing to do with the circle. And we were fortunate enough to design this project. This is a diplomatic residence for the people who work at the Chinese People's Republic of China's embassy here in the District of Columbia. And one reason we were hired, 10 architect, was we lived in the neighborhood, we knew residential, and we knew how to get things approved. And so we had not one person in opposition to this building. And why is that? Well, because it goes with the neighborhood. And the Chinese specifically wanted windows in their kitchens. So one advantage we had over a lot of other new buildings was that just like the building on the right, which has windows over the sink in the kitchen, this building has windows over the sink in the kitchen. And so people can imagine, they can project themselves psychologically into that building and say, oh yeah, I could see washing my dishes here, looking out at the life of the street. So these picture frames of the life inside are what the public sees. And from inside, you also have these crop views of the life of the city outside. So there's this reciprocal quality between looking at a building from a distance in bits and pieces and imagining getting married there, or looking into a window and seeing people sitting down to dinner, but also when people are in the building, looking out at the passing parade of life on the street. And so here's that building on the right side. Here's coming across this wonderful bridge into the district. There's our wedding pavilion on the left and the Chinese embassy on the right, almost like guard towers. The lower photo from a bridge, the Duke Ellington Bridge, designed by Paul Craig.
So Phil, sorry to interrupt, but it would be great if you would finish in around 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm just about there.
Perfect. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. So the Chinese, they wanted their apartments to go from front to back, so we didn't have a corridor, which meant we had to have 7 different elevators, and we needed to camouflage those in this curvy rooftop shape that people can come up to the roof. And we see them walking around in the evenings overlooking this sunken court. Here's the building across the street that's ours. Here's a view of the building from the ground. You can see we have sort of that better stone base, so love, and all these bas reliefs on top, projecting balconies. Here's a view from the other side. So you sort of picked up on sort of the window monument patterns and the sort of gate. And this nice little bench people like to sit on. But in fact, it's a crash barrier that people then use as a bench. They don't realize it's meant to keep cars from crashing into the building. I doubt that would. And here's a view looking down again, and you can see that canopy. It has ginkgo leaves in the plastic interlayer. And here's the canopy under construction. And the reason I'm saying this is that having come from this kind of maker's background, people who made things, I love getting to work with people like this fabricator. There's a group called Heavy Metal. And mostly they make guardrails for inside of fire stairs. But somehow they get the contract to do this. And we work with them. And they were beyond excited to be putting together this kind of Art Nouveau canopy. And we went there on the shop floor and we asked them if they could change the angles of certain things. We had enough room to get in between these 2 verticals to repaint this building, which would obviously have to happen. And then you see on the pattern, on the sunlight comes through, these ginkgo leaves and these sort of spheres that keep people from going onto the sidewalk. And here's a view as I walk out of my building. And this is the kind of thing you say to the commission. This terracotta from 1910 has the geometric resonance with the actual shape of our building, its penthouse, and the other parts of it, and its embellishments, these scallops, and the way this goes up, and then this free end of this wall. Here's some of our guys putting in the panels. These panels are actually 2-story units that are hoisted into place. Once again, sponsors did the molds for these that were then sent down to Virginia to our precasters. So I just love this idea of looking at the various people putting together, because isn't that what people like Gaudi did and the other modernistas? So here's that filigree pattern, crisp as hell. And then these sort of floral forms that create a nice little carpet on the floor. So view up, paint the undersides of the balcony is blue, like the sky. Here's a picture of the window. We worked very hard to find a way to push our window inboard so that when you look at the reflection, it looks like it's a 16-inch thick wall. And that's because we put the shelf angle above that precast lintel, because this is a cavity wash. Once again, a view of the shadows. And then finally, a view from that pavilion on our building across to our neighbors. You can get up there and wave back and forth to them. Sometimes I think they think they shouldn't be doing that because, you know, they'd be violating some diplomatic protocols, but mostly you see people walking up there. Grandparents come, they stay with the kids, and then you see just these little perforated green glazed terracotta egg shapes that hide the highest part of the elevator overruns. And that's it. Did I finish on time?
It was perfect. Thank you very much.
So
So there's one question for the audience, and thank you very much for your presentation, Phil.
You're welcome.
I think this question is in reference to the second building you have shown in DC. Herman asks, I really like those curved floors with floral motifs. How is it actually constructed? Is it carved in stone and actually part of the wall, or it's some kind of cladding that is held on to the wall? So if you could elaborate on that, that would be great.
Can I, I have to go back and I guess wait.
Sure, no problem. Take your time.
Right. So somebody asked about curves. Oh, the arc?
No, I mean this fifth floor, I'd say, like the one that are curved and they're going horizontally upwards. Sure how to, like this with floral motifs. Yeah, exactly the one that you're holding.
The floral motifs, not okay. Yeah, the floral motifs. Well, carpenters, they built positive version of this in wood, and then they made a negative version of this, and then they poured concrete into it. And actually, they're only very careful. There's only actually 2 molds. There's a left and a right. Maybe there are actually 4 molds here, because I don't think
I would say 4. I see 4 joints, but
yeah, there's actually a joint in the middle of the window at the end windows,
yeah,
and one up the center. If you look very closely, just under the sill, see the windows on either end, the small windows on either end. If you look straight up, there's actually a very fine seam there. And then right in the middle, there's a fine seam. So there are actually 4 different pieces that were put together in the yard. And then there's metal clips, and they're clipped to the concrete roof slab and the floor slab.
okay, so they're actually held by the slab.
Yeah, they're not sitting on the brick. They're actually welded. Yeah, galvanized, welded in beds in the steel, in the projecting concrete slab edge, top and bottom.
Okay, thank you.
And yesterday somebody was talking about, you know, the evolution of how you build buildings. And so I've sort of gone through the evolution of how people went from solid walls to veneers, and the first efforts were not so good. And we're sort of evolving back towards a better version, a solid wall that still has a cavity with mineral wall, but then some kind of ceramic concrete block, but hopefully in the future, extruded clay tile backup walls. So you're insulating between the brick veneer and a hefty wall that achieves the temperature of the inside of the building. So you lower and raise the peaks and valleys of your heating and cooling load to save energy.
Like, I guess in this case it is quite okay because there's balcony behind it. So the thermal, yeah, of course you're right. Yeah, thank you.
We were a little worried that people might find this obscuring their view, but apparently not. They kind of like it. It's like a Belvedere or something.
All right, thank you very much. So there's one more question by John. May I ask how much the Chinese residence cost per square foot to build? If you have this information on top of your head.
Good question. Now I know it was, let's see, of course it was completed about 2 years ago. It was about 110, all in about $110 million for the construction. That included, holding up the facade of the historic building on the right and then filling behind it. And can't recall at the moment the square footage of the building. So if you email me, I'll try to come up with the square footage and you can just do a division. It wasn't wildly more expensive than some of the other buildings we've done though. And today they'd be higher, but they were in the $250 per square foot range. And I think that included a burden for one parking space per apartment on a lower level. So that's sort of a gross cost per square foot above grade to capture the cost of a parking space below grade. I think that's gone up quite a bit from when those buildings were done pre-COVID.
All right. So Phil, I think these were all of the questions from the chat. And I think we will hand it over to Neil Burris. Dr. Burris, are you there?
Well, yes, thank you very much. Does anybody else have any comments they'd like to make on what we just saw?
Maybe I would have one more question to the first building, this college in Virginia.
I'm sorry.
Yes, the college in Virginia. That's a really good question.
Yeah, like I didn't know yet. Like I have a question about this arc.
Yes.
Yeah, like it looks actually really nice. Also those details, very inventive motifs with this DNA chain and stuff. But I have one question regarding the pillars. Like on the one photo I saw that this arch is cut in actually 3 pieces by the 2 pillars that are holding it. Why didn't you actually decide to maybe also divide this arch in 3 arches, like the one big in the middle and the smaller? Or is it somehow that at the end of the project the engineers came up with the need for the additional support? Or
it's that's a Vierendeel steel truss that is hidden, that frames around each window, and it sits on so you saw those heavy pillars underneath the building?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, let me just go. Well, so those are like almost like a highway bridge and hidden. And they cantilever off each end and they pick up that steel truss. And then the curve is really almost like a skirt, like a theater curtain that is dropped off the edge. And the soils here are awful. So we need to put quite hefty drilled caisson foundations in to support any load, even its own load of the foundation. So putting that was actually economical, but also there was a great concern amongst alumni and people who, the president of the school, who had to sell this to the Board of Visitors, that we weren't in any way blocking a view of the war memorial. And so putting everything in the middle of that stand didn't work. And by putting the piers where we did, managed to make a more economical structure, but also kind of define the entrance a little bit better than if we didn't have them, then it would look a little weird that there was this archway and where would those Vierendeels come down? So somehow it all resulted in us spanning just from curb to curb using those large pairs of columns that post beams. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's completely answers. Thank you. Actually, what I just wanted, like, it looks also great, but I was just asking why it was decided to do this this way.
That's fine. That's good.
Yeah,
there's a whole chain of logic as you go through these things. I mean,
Phil, just to make you feel a little better about the skirt on the bottom of the bridge, the arch on the bottom of the Tour Eiffel is not structural.
Oh,
it's visual. It's visual.
Yeah.
So the idea of having actually an arch An arch support seems to be more organic than a straight beam or definitely a cantilever. Anyways, I would like to, I'd like to invite everybody to day 2 of tag 23. Thank you all for being here. The reason we are here, kind of, we can say actually, is that 40% of all energy and 40% of all emissions go to and come from buildings. It could be that 40% of climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, all the troubles we have actually come from how we have been building the built environment. My name is Nir Burris, and I am a 40 years architect, PhD in modern design, history and theory. I designed Grand Central Madison and worked on DFW Terminal D and the Capitol Complex. I'm founder of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the ICAA and the Classic Planning Institute. My book, published by Harvard, answers the question, what have we ejected in terms of the knowledge of the built environment from what we have been using in the last 100 years, 50 to 100 years. Part of the efforts here are to create the Classic Planning Institute as a holistic organization that represents a holistic method. We have 5 parts: the library, the laboratory, the academy, the studio, and the STOA. And we are holding tag 23, can be described as a building, if you will. We're holding tag 23 in the STOA. Values unique to tag 23 are that architecture is central to urbanism. You know from all planning today, literally all the versions that are out there, that the architects, the planners consider the architecture not important. It's in the plan, they tell us, but it really is not. It's in the architecture, because when you stand in the street, 90% of what you see is buildings. So it's got to be the architecture. We are genuinely holistic, based on the Vitruvian idea of firmness, commodity, delight, which actually translates the Greek notion of the unity of truth, beauty, and goodness into the terminology of the built environment. We understand fully the balance of town and country. And I would like to refer you to Ebenezer Howard's book, Garden Cities, where he actually, the countryside is more important than the garden city. We didn't understand that. We haven't understood that since the first garden cities. And finally, the crafts may be essential for individual, societal, and planetary well-being. It could be that public works, fine, great public works of beautiful buildings and communities and neighborhoods and infrastructure is the savior of where we are headed right now. We witness today all this nonsense, and really makes you wonder why. And the answer is that we're already deep in the future. That architecture that you just saw was supposed to be a reflection of the future, but we are deeper into the future than it can actually convey. And all the terrible challenges that are still ahead of us and have been foretold since the 70s and 80s quite scientifically by the futurists that are among us is kind of the legacy that we leave the next generation. But to continue with 21st century errors, which really are a full-on extension of 20th century errors, is no way to proceed. I think we all recognize that that's why we're here. Forgetting the human, the blind belief in technology. You've just heard from Phil Esocoff. And by the way, Mr. Cantor, after every session, please stop the recording and restart it. Thank you. So at the end of this, you can do that. Blind belief in technology. The idea of selling strangeness as progress from the idea of iconicity driving design rather than human well-being. And in terms of human well-being, the annihilation of beauty, which has been consistent and all the way through since World War II. And yes, we can understand the processes, and we're going to have sessions here that deal with why, how did this all happen and come about. But the bottom line is we need that beauty for our well-being. And we believe and we understand that if we have an idea of where people, buildings, and cities need to actually stand at for the mutual well-being of all involved, we can ask for what is good for people. And that's what we are talking about throughout TAG. So welcome to TAG 23. We're going to do some housekeeping right now. I'm wondering if Ms. Hogg is around to help us out here. And Mr. Voresh, do you mind alternating on reading the ground rules, please?
Sure,
No
I
problem.
guess. Well, ladies first, Alison.
Thank you. So ground rule number 1, the traditional architecture gathering environment is one of open-mindedness and quality of discourse. Participants are encouraged to debate each other's ideas from positions of mutual respect and good manners.
Number 2, by joining a session or online thread, you agree to avoid ad hominem statements regarding individuals present or absent, and sectarian, religious, partisan, political, or aesthetic ideologies for their own sake.
In case of disagreement, we believe that all statements made in our community must be first heard, and then the parties submit to mediation until cordiality is resumed, or to the point of, I can live with this.
Number 4, session leaders and/or moderators will perform the duty of umpire of their own sessions. Infractions will lead to a warning, followed by an ejection from a session upon a second occurrence.
And finally, judgment calls may not be questioned in real time. Session infractions will be addressed within 48 hours of the event closing by a quorum of 3 event organizers as elected by the organizing committee.
Do the media release. Everybody here authorizes the Classic Planning Institute to use images, recordings, etc. All materials that come from this event. It says here tag 4.2, but it is for this tag as well. That's our generic statement. You understand that you will not be compensated and that attending this event releases us from any liability. And once entering the session, you agree to this. And if you do not, please leave. Final notification with regard to continuing education. At the end of every session, there is going to be a poll. Mr. Cantor, can you please present the poll for the first session while we're finishing up this introduction so people can fill it out? In order to receive a certificate of attendance for self-reporting, you're requested to please fill out this certificate and CE registration form at the end of each session. And if you don't do that, send it to cgiclassicplanning.com, whatever you have, within an hour of the session's closing. We have a record of your presence here through Zoom, and we have date stamps on emails. I want to very much thank the CP STOA TAG 23 volunteers, Ms. Alison Hogg, who's a board member of the CPI, Mr. Aaron Holt of FFKR, who helped so generously with the CEUs, Cecilia Kent from Street Level Sydney, who's helped us in the back office extensively, and last but not least, Mr. Voresh from Oldenburg, who has more than any other of all volunteers contributed here in time and time again. CPI staff supporting TAG 23, I want to thank you, Tasneem Zraikat, Zareen Rafadia, and Angela Kapp for the extraordinary work that you have done in anticipation of the of today, of these 3 days. And finally, the TAG organizing committee, Roger Jackson, FAIA, Philip Esocoff FAIA, Pablo Alvarez Funes, our IBA, and myself are the committee. Without them, there would be no TAG 23. Also, without the support of Arben Precastone, exceedingly generous support of Alan Macy, this event would likely not have taken place. Also, thanks go to AP Formliner, Architectural Palmers, Marshall Walters, thank you so much for the beautiful work you are doing. And Vetterstone and Alabama Stone, Philip Nelson, thank you very much. And here's their little proof that they can do anything in stone, although it seems to me that the challenges that Phil Esocoff presented to them were a little beyond Snoopy over here, but we're not quite done with our thanks. Community support, thank you for your extremely generous support. The platinum, Jonathan Smith, gold, do you want to carry on reading this, Mr. Voresh, please, to say thank you to the people?
Sure, thank you too. Platinum, Jonathan Smith. Gold, Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg, Bruce Donnelly, Christopher Andrews, Chris Fagan, Patrick Westu, James Evarts, Silver, Sean Perry, Christopher Weeks, James Dorothy, Abraham Calhern, Isabella Tinifana, Bronze, Batul Al-Musawi, Bilena Kirkelis Bingre, and David Broussard. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Finally, our keynote speaker tomorrow, Witold Rybczynski, giving you, Yale University Press, his press, is giving you a 30% discount with this code on the story of architecture. I can put this code in the, I'll put it here in the chat window, unless you beat me to it. Let's see if this works. I'm putting it in the chat window. It's a really sweet book. It's very cleverly done. No, it didn't work. Let me try again. It's a very clever book. It's very well done, beautifully edited, and so on and so forth. And we'll hear from it tomorrow in Rybczynski's conversation about why ornament matters. And you heard Mr. Esocoff speak so much about ornament, and so much of the drivers of what he does is ornament, that it really makes you wonder, why is he one of the only folks out there doing genuine architecture with that kind of stuff? Today, we have already enjoyed Phil Esocoff's recreational dialogue. We're going to have 5 more very interesting sessions. One is Deep Green. We're going to delve deep into 21st century construction for well-being, well-building. Well-building has three features, three characteristics: firmness, commodity, and delight. We're going to have a rather extensive and not so short discussion, 5 rings of architectural neuroscience. It's going to be led by Ann Sussman, and we're going to have several guests discuss different types of neuroscientific relationship to the built environment, at least 5 of them. We're going to have a really in-depth conversation about fabric and motion, Penn Station, Kayala, and Val d'Europe. Kayala is going to be presented by Leon Creer, Val d'Europe by Raymond Chan and others. I believe that John Simpson is coming back for that. I don't honestly recall right now offhand. And Penn Station is the project by Richard Cameron. I just got a message here in the chat. Richard Cameron is going to talk about rebuilding Penn Station, and you all know that the Pennsylvania Hotel across the street from it by McKinley White is being taken down as we speak. No words on that. I don't think I can tolerate the idiocy of doing something like that. And then we're going to have the 4 main programs, non-academic programs that are out there doing the leading edge, truly leading edge architectural training today are going to be presented. So we have a really fabulous session for today. Our keynote speaker was Phil Esocoff, and R-band, precast stone, and formliner people, and so on and so forth. They were the folks who supported his great work, and thank you, Phil, for bringing them here to support our great initiative. Thank you. We are going to take a 1-minute detour to hear. I think everybody's finished this. If you're not done with your CEU registration, please ask for more time in the chat window. Otherwise, we're going to go for a 1-minute intermission by, not intermission, but injection of Nikos Salingaros. Professor Salingaros, we're happy to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Nir. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, well, I went to a lot of trouble to invite people who did not know about the conference from South America, from Europe, Southern Europe, and from Africa. And I think some of the people have joined. And I want to point out a curious phenomenon and a disturbing phenomenon, that a certain high-profile national museums in the last few years have been built that are horrible, repulsive, and ugly at tremendous cost. Yesterday and today, and we're not even half through the conference, we have seen the most gorgeous buildings built today with modern techniques that look absolutely human and they're appealing. We saw very classical buildings, Greco-Roman buildings yesterday. They're all gorgeous. Today we saw Phil Esocoff build very beautiful modern buildings that are attractive, that have ornamentation. Nothing, they don't look anything like classical buildings, yet they're attractive. Here are new buildings. Throughout the world, the propaganda is propagated that such buildings don't exist. No new buildings are built because for some made-up reason, they cannot be built. So here is the counter example of gorgeous buildings being built today, yet national governments continue to build important, iconic buildings that are horrible, horrible, horrible. So I hope that some of the attendees over the 3 days will take this message home and propagate it among the rest of the world. Thank you, Nir, for the opportunity to speak.
Yes, it's all true. What can I say? We try to stay actually in consistency with our understanding of truth, goodness, and beauty. We try to focus on the good. If some stuff is going on there that is not good or not right, all we can do is lead by example by doing the right stuff, live our lives by example. I don't think we have another option to pit ourselves against things that really, I don't know, everybody makes the choice for themselves how they want to conduct themselves. I think we're done with the registration. Thank you for your point. We're going into the deep green. Miss Everard, how long did you make your session? Did you design?